What if I told you that one social media post could potentially reshape the entire economic relationship between two of the world's closest trading partners? What if a single statement from the most powerful leader in the Western Hemisphere could threaten billions of dollars in trade, put countless jobs at risk, and fundamentally alter the way nations conduct diplomacy in the 21st century? Today, I'm bringing you a story that has sent shockwaves through political and economic circles on both sides of the border, a story that reveals just how quickly international relations can shift in our modern era, and a story that every single person watching needs to understand because its implications will touch your life whether you realize it or not. I've been covering international news for years, and I have to tell you, the developments over the past few days have been nothing short of extraordinary. We're witnessing a dramatic escalation in tensions between the United States and Canada, two nations that have historically enjoyed one of the most stable and prosperous trading relationships in the world. The catalyst for this sudden shift involves a preliminary trade agreement between Canada and China, a deal that seemed relatively modest in scope, but has now become the flashpoint for what could become a significant trade conflict. President Donald Trump has reversed his initial supportive stance on this agreement and is now threatening devastating economic consequences for Canada if they proceed with closer ties to Beijing. The speed at which this situation has evolved is remarkable, and I want to walk you through every detail so you can fully grasp what's happening and what it means for the future. Let me take you back to the beginning of this story to provide some essential context. Prime Minister Mark Carney recently concluded a significant trade trip to China, where Canadian officials secured a preliminary agreement aimed at improving trade relations between the two nations. The deal itself was actually quite straightforward in its immediate objectives. Canada agreed to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles entering the Canadian market, and in return, China agreed to reduce tariffs on Canadian canola products. For Canadian farmers, particularly those in the prairie provinces who depend heavily on canola exports, this was welcome news. The agricultural sector had been pushing for better access to the Chinese market for years, and this agreement seemed to represent a positive step forward in that direction. At the same time, the deal raised concerns among certain domestic groups, including Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who worried about the impact of cheaper Chinese electric vehicles on Canadian auto workers and even called for a boycott of Chinese EVs. So even before the American response, this agreement was generating debate within Canada itself about the proper balance between trade opportunities and protecting domestic industries. Following the China trip, Prime Minister Carney traveled to the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, where he delivered what many observers described as a powerful and well-received speech. In that address, Carney spoke about the changing nature of the global order, suggesting that the old frameworks that had governed international relations for decades were no longer adequate for the challenges of today. He called upon middle powers around the world to unite and work together to navigate this new landscape. While Carney did not explicitly name the United States in his remarks, the implications were clear to anyone paying attention. He was responding to recent aggressive rhetoric from Washington, including President Trump's statements about potentially taking over Greenland and his continued references to Canada becoming the 51st state. Carney's speech was a declaration of independence in many ways, an assertion that Canada would chart its own course in global affairs rather than simply following American directives. This message resonated strongly with many Canadians who have grown frustrated with what they perceive as bullying tactics from their southern neighbor, but it also set the stage for the confrontation that would follow. President Trump's initial reaction to the Canada-China trade deal was surprisingly measured and even supportive. When asked about the agreement during a press availability, Trump said it was okay and that signing a trade deal with China was a good thing for Canada to do. This response seemed to indicate that the American administration understood Canada's need to diversify its trading relationships and was not particularly concerned about the preliminary agreement. However, that apparent acceptance would prove to be extremely short-lived, and within days, the tone from Washington would change dramatically in ways that caught many observers off guard and raised serious questions about the predictability and consistency of American foreign policy under this administration. I need to share with you exactly what happened next because the shift in President Trump's position was so abrupt and so severe that it demands careful examination. Just days after expressing support for Canada's right to pursue trade deals with China, Trump took to his social media platform to issue what can only be described as an ultimatum to the Canadian government. In a post that immediately dominated headlines on both sides of the border, the president wrote that if Governor Carney thinks he's going to make Canada a drop-off port for China to send goods and products into the United States, he is sorely mistaken. Trump went on to claim that China will eat Canada alive and completely devour it. The language was stark, aggressive, and designed to provoke a reaction, but the president didn't stop with rhetoric. He then made a concrete threat that has enormous economic implications, declaring that if Canada makes a deal with China, it will immediately be hit with a 100% tariff against all Canadian goods and products coming into the USA. And I want you to pause and consider the magnitude of that threat for a moment. A 100% tariff on all Canadian goods entering the United States would be absolutely devastating for the Canadian economy. Canada exports approximately $400 billion worth of goods to the United States annually, making America by far Canada's largest trading partner. A tariff of this magnitude would effectively double the price of Canadian products for American consumers and businesses, making them uncompetitive virtually overnight. Industries ranging from automotive manufacturing to energy to agriculture would face catastrophic consequences. Hundreds of thousands of jobs would be at risk. The economic integration between Canada and the United States that has developed over decades would be thrown into chaos. This is not a minor policy disagreement or a negotiating tactic that can be easily dismissed. This is a threat that, if carried out, would fundamentally alter the economic landscape of North America. What makes this situation even more complex is the deliberate language that President Trump used in his social media post. You'll notice that he referred to Prime Minister Carney as Governor Carney. This is not an accident or a mistake. Trump previously used the same term when referring to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau during discussions about Canada potentially becoming the 51st state of the United States. By reverting to this terminology, Trump is signaling that he views Canadian sovereignty with a certain level of contempt and that he still entertains notions of absorbing Canada into the American political structure. This linguistic choice represents a form of diplomatic insult that goes beyond mere trade disputes. It suggests a fundamental lack of respect for Canada as an independent nation and a separate equal partner in international relations. For many Canadians, this aspect of Trump's messaging is as offensive as the economic threats themselves, perhaps even more so because it attacks their national identity and self-determination. The timing of Trump's reversal is also significant and worth examining closely. His initial supportive comments about the Canada-China deal came before Prime Minister Carney's speech at Davos. It was only after Carney stood before the World Economic Forum and spoke about the ruptured global order and the need for middle powers to unite that Trump's tone changed so dramatically. This sequence of events suggests that Trump's tariff threat is not primarily about trade policy or concerns about Chinese goods entering the American market through Canada. Rather, it appears to be a punitive response to Carney's public challenge to American leadership and his assertion that Canada will pursue an independent foreign policy. In other words, this may be less about economics and more about politics, about punishing a leader who dared to suggest that the United States is no longer the unquestioned arbiter of the international order. During his own speech at Davos, Trump responded directly to Carney's remarks by declaring that Canada lives because of the United States, a statement that further inflamed tensions and reinforced the perception that this conflict is fundamentally about power, respect, and national pride rather than tariff rates and trade balances. Prime Minister Carney was not silent in the face of these attacks. Speaking at a cabinet retreat in Quebec City, Carney delivered his own response to Trump's aggressive rhetoric. He declared that Canada thrives because we are Canadian, directly countering Trump's claim about Canadian dependence on the United States. This exchange of statements represents a significant escalation in the war of words between the two leaders and demonstrates that Carney is not willing to back down or adopt a submissive posture in response to American pressure. This approach differs markedly from the more cautious diplomatic style that characterized some of his predecessors' interactions with the Trump administration. Carney appears to have calculated that showing strength and resolve is more effective than attempting to appease a leader who may interpret conciliation as weakness. Whether this strategy will prove successful remains to be seen, but it has certainly galvanized Canadian public opinion and created a sense of national unity in the face of external threats. So I think it's absolutely essential that we take a closer look at the actual substance of the Canada-China agreement that has sparked this entire controversy. Because when you examine the details, you'll find that President Trump's characterization of the deal as some kind of free trade arrangement is fundamentally inaccurate. I spoke with experts and analyzed the available information, and what emerges is a picture that's far more nuanced than the inflammatory rhetoric from Washington would suggest. Professor Fenn Osler Hampson, a respected expert in international affairs at Carleton University, provided crucial context that I believe everyone needs to understand. According to Professor Hampson, the agreement that Canada signed with China simply restored the pre-tariff war status quo on select goods like canola and electric vehicles. This is a critical distinction that has been lost in much of the coverage of this story. We're not talking about a comprehensive free trade agreement that would open Canadian markets to unlimited Chinese goods or create a backdoor for Chinese products to flood into the United States. Let me break down the specifics for you so there's no ambiguity about what this deal actually entails. Under the preliminary agreement, there are still ongoing tariffs in place on both sides. China continues to impose a 15% tariff on Canadian canola seed and pork products entering the Chinese market. Canada maintains a 6% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles coming into Canada. These are not the characteristics of a free trade arrangement. As Professor Hampson pointedly noted, that's not free trade, it's anything but. The agreement represents a modest de-escalation of trade tensions between Canada and China, not the creation of some new economic alliance that threatens American interests. The fact that President Trump has portrayed it as something far more dramatic and dangerous raises serious questions about whether his administration fully understands the agreement or whether they are deliberately mischaracterizing it for political purposes. What I find particularly striking about this situation is the apparent hypocrisy in the American position, and I don't use that word lightly. It was only a couple of months ago that the United States itself signed an agreement with China to lower tariffs on Chinese goods. In exchange for these tariff reductions, China agreed to allow American exports of semiconductors and other high-tech products that Chinese companies want to purchase. So the United States has pursued exactly the same kind of bilateral tariff reduction with China that Canada is now being threatened with 100% tariffs for considering. How can the American administration justify threatening devastating economic consequences for Canada doing something that America itself has done? This inconsistency undermines the credibility of the American position and suggests that the real issue is not about protecting the North American market from Chinese goods, but about something else entirely. Perhaps it's about asserting dominance over Canadian foreign policy, or perhaps it's simply about domestic political messaging. Whatever the motivation, the double standard is impossible to ignore. I also want to address the legitimate concerns that have been raised within Canada itself about the China agreement, because this story is not simply about American overreach. As I mentioned earlier, Ontario Premier Doug Ford expressed serious reservations about the impact of lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles. The Canadian automotive industry employs hundreds of thousands of workers, and there are understandable fears that an influx of competitively priced Chinese EVs could harm domestic manufacturers and cost Canadian jobs. Ford even went so far as to call for a boycott of Chinese electric vehicles, reflecting the depth of concern in certain sectors. These are valid points that deserve consideration in any discussion of Canadian trade policy. The preliminary agreement with China was never set in stone, and there was always going to be debate and potential modifications as stakeholders weighed in on its implications. The American intervention has now complicated that domestic discussion enormously by introducing the threat of catastrophic tariffs that dwarf any concerns about Chinese EVs. Canadian policymakers are now faced with external pressure of unprecedented magnitude that may force them to make decisions based on fear of American retaliation rather than careful analysis of what's best for the Canadian economy and Canadian workers. The interconnection between this dispute and the broader framework of North American trade relations cannot be overstated. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, known as USMCA or CUSMA in Canada, is scheduled for renegotiation, and these talks were already expected to be challenging. American officials have made clear that they intend to push for significant changes to the agreement, particularly in areas like automotive manufacturing, agricultural supply management, and digital policies. Now, with tensions running so high over the China issue, the atmosphere for these negotiations has become even more fraught. United States Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick has already commented publicly that the Canada-China deal may jeopardize CUSMA renegotiations, suggesting that the American side may use this controversy as leverage to extract concessions from Canada in the upcoming talks. This linkage between the China dispute and CUSMA represents a significant escalation of the stakes involved and indicates that we may be entering a period of sustained tension in the Canada-US trading relationship. I've been thinking a lot about the diplomatic dimensions of this crisis and what it reveals about the state of international relations in our current moment. The exchange between President Trump and Prime Minister Carney at Davos represented a remarkable public confrontation between the leaders of two allied nations. The kind of open disagreement that would have been almost unthinkable in previous eras of Canada-US relations. When Trump declared that Canada lives because of the United States, he was making a claim about dependency and subordination that cuts to the heart of Canadian national identity. Canadians have always prided themselves on their independence, their distinct values, and their separate place in the community of nations. To be told by the American president that their very existence depends on American goodwill is deeply offensive to many Canadians, regardless of their political affiliations. Carney's response that Canada thrives because we are Canadian was designed to resonate with that sense of national pride and to signal that his government will not accept a subordinate position in the bilateral relationship. What we're witnessing is a fundamental clash of worldviews about how nations should relate to one another in the 21st century. President Trump's approach to foreign policy has consistently emphasized bilateral power dynamics, with the United States using its economic and military might to extract concessions from other countries. Canada, under Prime Minister Carney, appears to be articulating an alternative vision in which middle powers band together to create counterweights to great power dominance and preserve a rules-based international order. Carney's Davos speech about the ruptured global order was a direct challenge to the Trump administration's approach, and the fierce response from Washington indicates that this challenge was heard and understood. We are not simply dealing with a trade dispute here. We are dealing with a broader struggle over the future shape of international relations and Canada's place within that system. I want to provide some perspective on the economic realities that underpin this political drama, because the numbers matter enormously for understanding the leverage that each side possesses. The United States and Canada have one of the largest bilateral trading relationships in the world. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States, making America absolutely critical to the Canadian economy. However, the relationship is not entirely one-sided. Canada is among the top trading partners for the United States, and 32 American states count Canada as their single most important export market. American businesses and workers depend on Canadian trade, just as Canadian businesses and workers depend on American trade. 100% tariff on Canadian goods would not only devastate the Canadian economy, but would also significantly harm American consumers who would face higher prices and American industries that rely on Canadian inputs and Canadian customers. This mutual dependency provides Canada with some leverage, even if it is clearly the smaller partner in the relationship. The political dynamics within the United States also matter for how this situation may evolve. While President Trump has the authority to impose tariffs through various legal mechanisms, there are domestic constraints on his actions. Congress has a constitutional role in regulating foreign commerce, and there are members of both parties who represent districts and states that depend heavily on trade with Canada. These legislators have a strong interest in preventing a destructive trade war that would harm their constituents. Additionally, American business groups have historically lobbied against protectionist measures that disrupt supply chains and raise costs. Professor Hampson made an important point when he noted that it's Americans who are going to have to put the guardrails around their president, including Congress and including the 32 states for which Canada is their most important trading partner. This suggests that the most effective path for Canada may not be direct confrontation, but rather patient engagement with the diverse interests within the American political system that have reasons to oppose extreme tariff measures. The question of how Canada should respond to this crisis has generated significant debate among analysts and commentators. Some argue for a firm stance that demonstrates Canadian resolve and refuses to be bullied into submission. Others counsel a more cautious approach that avoids escalation and seeks to de-escalate tensions through quiet diplomacy. Professor Hampson offered his own perspective on this question, suggesting that Canada should not rise to the bait and should keep its head down while American domestic politics works to constrain the president. This is a pragmatic view that recognizes the limits of Canadian power in this situation. Canada cannot force the United States to abandon its aggressive posture through confrontation alone. The asymmetry in size and economic power between the two countries means that a full-blown trade war would hurt Canada far more than it would hurt the United States, even if the American economy would also suffer significant damage. Finding the right balance between defending Canadian interests and avoiding unnecessary escalation is the central challenge facing the Carney government in the weeks and months ahead. As I bring this analysis to a close, I want to reflect on what lies ahead and what the implications of this crisis might be for the long-term relationship between Canada and the United States. We are at a genuinely uncertain moment, and anyone who claims to know exactly how this situation will resolve is not being honest with you. The variables are too numerous and the personalities involved too unpredictable to allow for confident predictions. What I can tell you is that the stakes are extraordinarily high, and that the decisions made by leaders in Ottawa and Washington over the coming weeks could shape the trajectory of North American relations for years or even decades to come. This is not a minor diplomatic spat that will be forgotten in a news cycle or two. This is a potential inflection point in the history of Canada-US relations, and we should all be paying close attention. One of the most important developments to watch is the upcoming round of USMCA renegotiations. Canadian Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc is reportedly still scheduled to travel to Washington for talks as planned, but the atmosphere for those negotiations has been poisoned by the tariff threats and inflammatory rhetoric of recent days. The American side has signaled that they intend to take a hard line on issues like automotive manufacturing, agricultural supply management, and digital policies. Commerce Secretary Lutnick's comments about the Canada-China deal jeopardizing CUSMA talks indicate that the Americans may try to use this controversy as leverage to extract concessions. Canada will need to enter these negotiations with a clear sense of its priorities and red lines, while also demonstrating flexibility where possible. The challenge will be distinguishing between American demands that represent legitimate interests requiring compromise and demands that represent overreach requiring resistance. The broader question of Canada's relationship with China also hangs in the balance. The preliminary agreement on tariff reductions for canola and electric vehicles was always just a starting point, not a comprehensive framework for Canada-China relations. The political pressure from the United States may force Canada to reconsider how quickly and how far it wants to develop closer economic ties with Beijing. There are legitimate security concerns about Chinese influence and technology that exist independently of American pressure, and Canadian policymakers need to weigh these concerns carefully. At the same time, Diversifying trade relationships away from excessive dependence on the American market has been a Canadian policy goal for decades, and abandoning that goal entirely because of American threats would represent a significant surrender of Canadian autonomy. Finding the right path forward will require careful balancing of economic opportunities, security considerations, and the reality of American pressure. I want to emphasize the importance of accurate information and careful analysis at a moment like this. It would be easy to get swept up in the emotional drama of the confrontation between Trump and Carney, to pick sides and cheer for one leader or the other, but the decisions being made have real consequences for real people, for workers whose jobs depend on cross-border trade, for consumers who benefit from integrated supply chains, for farmers who need access to export markets, for communities on both sides of the border whose prosperity is intertwined. We owe it to these people to demand that our leaders make decisions based on facts rather than rhetoric, on careful calculation of national interest rather than personal pique or political posturing. The mischaracterization of the Canada-China agreement as something far more dramatic than it actually is should concern all of us who believe that policy should be grounded in reality. Looking ahead, I believe that the fundamental strengths of the Canada-US relationship will ultimately prevail, but the path to restoring stability will not be smooth or easy. The two countries are bound together by geography, history, shared values, and deep economic integration that cannot be easily undone by any single administration's policies. The question is how much damage will be inflicted along the way and how long it will take to repair. Canadian leaders will need to demonstrate both firmness in defending Canadian interests and wisdom in choosing their battles. American leaders will need to recognize that treating allies like adversaries ultimately weakens American influence and security. And citizens on both sides of the border will need to stay informed, stay engaged, and hold their leaders accountable for the decisions they make. I will continue to follow this story closely and bring you updates as events develop. The stakes are too high and the implications too significant for any of us to look away. This is a moment that will shape the future of our continent, and we all have a responsibility to pay attention and to demand better from those who lead us.